What if a single election map didn't just show results, but actively ripped a nation apart? Forget what you think you know about 1860, because the story of how one election pushed the US to the very brink is far more complex than a simple win or loss. We'll break down the critical party split, the hidden ballot geography, and the brutal Electoral College math. Then stress test the common myth that the popular vote should have decided the winner, revealing why this election wasn't just a political contest, but a prophecy of war. This isn't a simple two-person race. Oh no, it's far messier than that. The 1860 election features four major candidates, each vying for the presidency at a time when the very fabric of the nation was fraying. We have Abraham Lincoln, the rising star of the Republican Party, largely representing Northern interests and a clear stance against the expansion of slavery. Then there's Stephen Douglas, the incumbent senator from Illinois, and the standard-bearer for the Northern Democrats, pushing for popular sovereignty. Let the settlers decide on slavery themselves. His challenger within his own party is John C. Breckinridge, representing the Southern Democrats, who insisted on federal protection for slavery in all territories. And finally, there's John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, a candidate whose entire platform was essentially, let's all get along and uphold the Constitution without mentioning slavery. Four men, four distinct visions for a country already on the verge of fracturing. The stage was set, not for a fair fight between equals, but for a showdown where the very rules of engagement were skewed by geography and deeply entrenched beliefs. The country was already splitting along visible fault lines, and this election was about to make those cracks undeniable. The biggest story in 1860, the earthquake that reshaped the entire political landscape, wasn't a fiery speech or a dramatic debate. It was the implosion of the Democratic Party, shattering into two distinct regional tickets. This fracture, more than any single event, sealed the fate of the nation and put Abraham Lincoln on the path to the White House. Think about it. For decades, the Democratic Party had been the dominant political force in America, often serving as a fragile big tent, holding together pro-slavery Southerners and more moderate Northerners. But the relentless pressure of the slavery debate, especially concerning its expansion into new territories, finally pulled that tent apart. The breaking point arrived at the Democratic National Convention. Northern Democrats largely rallied behind Stephen Douglas, advocating for popular sovereignty. This idea that residents of a territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery seemed like a compromise to some, but it deeply angered the Southern wing. They saw it as insufficient protection for their peculiar institution and demanded a federal slave code for the territories, ensuring slavery could expand. When their demands weren't met, a significant portion of Southern delegates walked out. They reconvened later, nominating their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge. So, just like that, the nation's dominant political party became two regional parties, each with its own candidate, its own platform, and its own deep-seated grievances. Douglas ran as the Northern Democrat, trying to hold on to the vestiges of national unity while navigating the thorny issue of slavery. Breckinridge, on the other hand, represented Southern Democrats who wanted stronger, unambiguous federal protection for slavery's expansion into any new territory. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a fundamental ideological clash that tore the party's very soul apart. This split wasn't merely inconvenient, it was politically suicidal. Imagine trying to win a national election when your base is divided, and you're running two separate campaigns against each other. It immediately destroyed any viable path the Democrats had to winning the Electoral College. They effectively guaranteed they would split their votes in every state, handing an enormous advantage to their opponents. Meanwhile, while the Democrats were busy tearing themselves apart, the young Republican Party was consolidating much of the North behind a clear and potent message: stop slavery's expansion into new territories. They weren't abolitionists in the radical sense. They didn't advocate for ending slavery where it already existed. But their platform was unequivocally anti-expansion, appealing to a broad coalition of farmers, laborers, and industrialists in the free states who feared the economic and social consequences of slavery's spread. This unified message, coupled with the Democratic disarray, gave Lincoln a clear runway to victory in the populous North. Now, here's a crucial piece of the 1860 puzzle that often gets overlooked in typical history summaries: the actual ballot geography. This isn't just about who voted for whom. It's about who was even allowed to vote for whom and where. In much of the South, Abraham Lincoln's name wasn't even printed on the ballot. Think about that for a moment. The man who would become president was, for millions of Americans, not a selectable option in the election. His candidacy was considered so anathema, so dangerous to the Southern way of life, that he was simply excluded from the choice presented to voters. It wasn't a matter of unpopularity, it was a matter of absence. Conversely, in many parts of the North, especially in the staunchly Republican-leaning states, other candidates, particularly the Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and to a lesser extent, constitutional unionist John Bell, barely existed as viable choices. Their campaigns lacked the infrastructure, the funding, and the local support to mount a significant challenge. Their names might have appeared on some ballots, but without a robust party organization or widespread recognition, they were often non-factors. So, when people talk about the four-way race, it's vital to understand that voters weren't choosing among four equal options available everywhere. Instead, they were choosing from regional menus. In the North, it was largely a contest between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. In the Deep South, it was often John C. Breckinridge versus John Bell or Stephen Douglas. This created what historians call sectional voting, a phenomenon where voter choices were deeply divided along geographic and ideological lines rather than being a blend of national preferences. The implications of this ballot geography were profound. It meant that the election results were not just a reflection of differing opinions, but a stark illustration of a nation deeply fragmented, where political choices were literally dictated by where you lived. It reinforced the idea that the North and South were becoming two distinct political entities, with different concerns, different candidates, and ultimately, different visions for the country's future. This wasn't just a political divide, it was a cultural, economic, and moral chasm that the election process itself highlighted and deepened. The absence of national candidates meant the absence of national unity in the voting booths, pushing the country further down the path of division. Beyond the shattered parties and the uneven ballots, the cold, hard logic of the Electoral College played a decisive role in 1860. This system, established by the Founding Fathers, doesn't reward the person with the most individual votes nationwide. Instead, it rewards the candidate who can build a coalition across states to secure a majority of electoral votes. And here's the critical insight for 1860. The Electoral College inherently rewards unified regions. If you can win big, populous states, you win big chunks of electoral votes, often disproportionately so. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party understood this perfectly. Their strategy wasn't to win a national popular vote majority. They knew that was unlikely given their limited support in the South. Their strategy was to dominate the populous free states of the North. These states, with their large populations and strong anti-slavery expansion sentiment, offered a substantial block of electoral votes. By campaigning effectively and consolidating support in states like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, Lincoln was able to accumulate a significant number of electoral votes very quickly. And that's exactly what he did. Lincoln won nearly all of the free states. This overwhelming victory in the North, combined with the fact that his opponents split their support across the other candidates, allowed him to achieve an Electoral College majority. He didn't need a majority of the national popular vote. In fact, he garnered only about 39.8% of it. Yet, under the rules of the game, that didn't matter. He had secured enough electoral votes to legally and legitimately win the presidency. To put it in plain terms, Lincoln's victory was a masterful demonstration of how a cohesive, unified coalition can beat a fractured opposition within the Electoral College system. The Republicans had one candidate, one message, and one strategy focused on the North. The Democrats, however, split their national support between Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge, effectively canceling each other out in many places. Add John Bell's Constitutional Union Party into the mix, siphoning off even more votes, and you have three fractured factions fighting over the remaining electoral votes, often dividing them amongst themselves. The math was simple. One solid block of votes, even if it wasn't a national majority, proved far more powerful than three splintered efforts. Lincoln's victory was a testament not only to his campaign's effectiveness, but to the inherent mathematical advantage gained by exploiting the disunity of his opponents within the Electoral College framework. Now let's address a common complaint you'll hear about the 1860 election, one that still echoes in political debates today. Lincoln didn't win a majority of the popular vote, so he shouldn't have won. It's true, as we just discussed, Lincoln secured less than 40% of the national popular vote. On the surface, that might sound undemocratic, like a flawed outcome. But this argument fundamentally misunderstands how the American presidential election system worked then, and indeed, how it still works today. The critical point here is that the rules of the game weren't a national popular vote. The rules were and are the Electoral College. From the very beginning of the Republic, American presidential elections have been decided by electoral votes, not by a simple tally of every individual ballot cast across the country. This system was designed for a reason: to give a voice to smaller states and to foster national unity by requiring broad regional support, not just concentrated support in a few populous areas. When you say Lincoln shouldn't have won because he lacked a popular vote majority, you're essentially applying a different set of rules after the fact. This is akin to saying a baseball team shouldn't have won the World Series because their total runs scored throughout the season were less than another team's, even though they won more games in the playoffs. The rules for winning the series are about winning games, not cumulative runs. Here's why this distinction isn't just academic. If the rules were different, if the election had been decided by a national popular vote, the campaigns themselves would have been entirely different. Lincoln's campaign, knowing it didn't need to win a single vote in the Deep South to secure the presidency, focused its resources, time, and messaging almost exclusively on the free states of the North. His opponents likewise strategized based on the Electoral College map, not on racking up individual votes everywhere. Douglas, for example, campaigned tirelessly across the country, aiming to secure enough electoral votes himself, or at least deny any candidate a majority, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. Had the popular vote been the decider, candidates would have campaigned in every corner of the country, tailored their messages to national appeal, and sought votes wherever they could find them, north or south. The entire dynamic would have shifted. So, while you can certainly debate the merits of the Electoral College system itself, and people have for centuries, under the rules in place in 1860, Lincoln's victory was entirely legitimate. To argue otherwise is to ignore the fundamental mechanics of the election he won, and to project modern democratic ideals onto a system that operated with different objectives and strategies. His win by the established law of the land was valid, setting the stage for the dramatic events that followed. The 1860 election map is far more than just a colorful diagram showing who won which state. It's a stark, chilling X-ray of a nation in crisis, revealing two distinct political nations forming inside one country. This election didn't just reflect existing divisions, it solidified and broadcasted them for all to see. It showed sectional parties, candidates who couldn't even appear on ballots in certain regions, and electoral outcomes that were entirely predictable based on geography alone. Look at that map. Lincoln's victory was almost entirely contained within the free states of the North, West, and some border areas. The southern states, almost without exception, voted for either Breckinridge or Bell. There was virtually no overlap, no blending of political opinion across the Mason-Dixon line. This wasn't just a political divide, it was a cultural, economic, and moral chasm made visible through the ballot box. The map didn't create every tension, every deeply rooted difference that existed between North and South. But it undeniably proved that compromise, the delicate art of give and take that had held the Union together for decades, was finally failing. The election was a referendum on slavery's future, and the North, unified behind Lincoln, had delivered a verdict the South could not accept. For many Southerners, Lincoln's victory, even without a popular vote majority, signaled an existential threat to their way of life, their economy, and their perceived sovereignty. Almost immediately after Lincoln's victory was confirmed, the dominoes began to fall. Secession began, starting with South Carolina, which declared its departure from the Union in December 1860. Other Southern states quickly followed suit. The election of 1860 and the map it produced wasn't just a political event. It was the final, undeniable proof that the United States was, in all but name, already two separate countries. So, let's bring it all back home. One-sentence recap: a Democratic Party fractured beyond repair, regional-only ballots, and the specific math of the Electoral College all converged to produce a lawful presidential win for Abraham Lincoln, and in doing so, laid bare a union that was tragically coming apart at the seams. This election wasn't just about choosing a leader, it was about exposing the fundamental, irreconcilable differences that had festered within the nation for decades. For a deeper dive and to keep these crucial points handy, you can download a one-page summary of the 1860 map and takeaways right below this video. What happened after the election? Next, we'll explore Secession Explained, the explosive chain reaction from 1860 to the first shots fired at Fort Sumter. That video is linked right here for you.